Lobbying in the government. We're trying to think of an entertaining way of starting this episode, but we got nothing. So this is what you get. We're going to talk about lobbying today. So, thoughts, lobbying.
It's definitely an interesting one because I think we're going to need some of it in the government, but I don't necessarily love all of the side effects.
Right. So let's take a step back already and try to define lobbying so that we actually know what we're talking about and that we're on the same page. What is lobbying to you?
Well, a big thing for me is it's trying to talk to government officials. I think the government officials part is really important there.
Mm-hmm.
The people doing the talking typically are from a specific industry.
Okay.
Usually they're very familiar with it. They're the experts. And they're trying to inform these government officials about just what's going on. And they may try to persuade them to take very positive turns in legislation. You know, something that could benefit this industry.
I think you're adding a lot of explicit definitions when we're just trying to find a broad definition.
Probably.
I think there's some opinion already in that definition. So let's try and reduce it down. I agree. Yep, government officials. Basically anyone that works for the government that has power that is legislatively backed.
Yeah. I think having the power is important because there are going to be a lot of lower level people that don't have the power to do much.
Right. And I think that what lobbying is individuals in an industry that has the potential to be regulated by the government that are speaking with, informing, and trying to influence the government officials that may have an effect over their lives or their livelihoods.
I can definitely see that.
And the main distinction that I want to call it is it's not necessarily in a positive way. There are industries that I'll get to that try to introduce legislation that will actually hurt the company for tactical reasons. And I'll come back to that later. And I think Facebook has been doing this recently, as well as just several other very large companies may actually do things to harm the industry for self-benefit. It's really strange, but we'll come back to that later. So trying to influence government outcomes or government officials specifically, whether that be with information, with money, with bribery, with blackmail. There are lots of versions of lobbying. I think just our definition of lobbying is any attempt from an industry that has the risk of being regulated by the government trying to influence the government outside of elections.
I can see that, especially outside of elections being important.
Right. Well, even in elections, with influencing voting, that can have a big impact. But I mean, besides voting, they themselves going and voting.
We can separate that out a little bit.
Any sort of government influence or attempted influence outside of casting a vote, let's call that lobbying.
I think that works.
Okay. And I realize that may not be the technical definition and we may be broadening it, but that's the topic. That's what we're going to be talking about. Agreed?
Agreed.
Cool. So, is lobbying good?
Well, that's tricky.
Or are there any benefits?
I mean, there's definitely the point of actually informing these officials because they're not going to be experts in everything. I can't expect, a senator to know a whole lot about agriculture as well as IT.
A lawyer is very infrequently going to be a farmer.
Exactly.
So you need someone from the industry to be able to inform legislatures or senators or whoever's making the laws of, here's how this piece of legislation would affect me. Here's something that is problematic for me. Here's something that goes well. Here's something that doesn't go well. And here's something where I think regulation could help. And you need people from the industry to tell you how the industry runs. Could we get that benefit from somewhere else? For instance, just having government officials go into the industry, try to learn about the ropes and how things are done.
I think it could help in some cases, but a lot of that experience in the industry comes from just time. Are we going to send our government official out to work with a corn farmer for 3 years so that they can know the ins and outs of how to farm corn?
And you could do it as an audit of just kind of watch what they're doing, or every once in a while come over and see what's going on. But if the business or the group B that is at risk of being regulated has reason to hide certain things, then they may selectively expose what they're doing. So the people that you actually want to be informants, I don't want to say government informant because that has a negative connotation to it, but if you want people to be informing the government, you want them to have full access to that industry, or have had full access to that industry.
Right. We don't just want to show off the good parts. We also want our officials to know the bad.
Right. But if you're coming from that industry and you're ingrained in that industry, maybe you have other reasons to suggest different legislation, because if you have connections in that industry, you may be able to benefit from those connections. So I guess our first question is, can you separate, or how do you try and separate the benefits that different businesses or industries can give to people that become legislatures? Let me rephrase a little bit. How do you manage that properly? How do you manage the potential excessive influence that people who were in the industry can have once they start working for the government?
I mean, it would be great to know all of their biases in that industry, have an idea of, oh, these are still their connections, and they could be getting kickbacks. But that'd be really hard to regulate.
So it depends on how you go about it. Knowing what a person's bias is, yeah, that can be really, really difficult. But knowing who's influencing them, particularly monetarily, that can be easier. Let's say once you are working for the government, your finances need to be public. Or if there's any sort of donation, particularly coming from a business in which you have say over or can regulate, that needs to be disclosed. If I used to work in the oil industry, now I'm a legislature, and I have jurisdiction over an area that has a lot of oil companies. If an oil company executive buys me lunch, that should be public knowledge.
I can definitely see that. Some of those might get tricky, though, because how small of a amount of money do you want to track?
Anything. And this is actually something that is not unheard of already. In the U.S., that is something that, I've known people that have worked in the government and say, like, even if you don't have much of a say, if someone offers to buy you lunch and it's even possibly because you're a government official, or there's any hinting at, hey, you work for the government, mind if I buy you lunch? Your default answer should be no, unless you have a good reason to accept it. There's already regulation out there to try and prevent influencing of that sort. Now, it would be difficult to track and forcibly track of, like, oh, you're getting this much money, how are you paying for food? And it means that if you're working for the government, you would have to be under a lot more scrutiny and give up a lot more of your privacy freedoms.
But that is something that could be useful in a case like this.
And I agree. It's the type of thing where if you're working in a public office, how much of your life should be public? And I think that one of the ways that we could protect against undue influence or unfair influence is to make their lives more public. The question would be, to what degree?
Yeah, because I would like to know when my representative has had lunch with oil executives for 30 times in the past 6 months.
Let me throw a curveball. Let's say they're not buying lunch. Let's say there's a male legislator and there's a female oil exec, and she decides, I'm going to go over to his house and take him into the bedroom and maybe take off my clothes, and he'll happen to enjoy this time that I spend with him. Should that be publicized as much as a lunch?
I mean, it probably has just as much, if not more, sway.
True. So,
man, that would be awkward to read those reports.
Right? Of like, yep, so this person is literally in bed with oil companies. To what degree can their lives be monitored and publicized? And would that be an advantage?
I think to the extent of, having that oil exec over for whatever, that might be a little bit much to get into the love life of your senators.
So relationships should not be publicized. What if we don't know the nitty-gritty details of, and then she unzipped his pants? Like, okay, we don't need those level of details, but let's say you're a senator and you're married to someone who is the CEO at an oil company. Should that be public knowledge?
I think so. Because your spouse is definitely going to influence you.
What if you're dating? Should that be public knowledge?
If it's more long term, yeah.
Who determines whether it's long term?
That's the tricky thing, because things could move fast.
Relationships frequently do.
Right.
But maybe they don't know that it's long term, and then they decide that it's long term. Is there a time limit of how long they can disclose it?
Yeah, that's where things get really tricky. Because, dating for 1 month, but, they're taking things slow. Okay. The other person probably doesn't have as much influence as somebody where, they've known each other a long time.
But even if you have known each other for a long time, you have even more reason to benefit your spouse or your long-term partner. So I don't want to talk about like how much should we know about our senators and representatives in terms of relationship status. It's more of, can publicizing their lives, or how much of the publicizing their lives should be acceptable? I think it should be if there is direct monetary benefit, because that's the easiest thing to track, of if you are spending much more than you're taking in, that should be easily noticeable, and it should start taking into question, okay, where is this money coming from? And perhaps if it becomes problematic, start having audits, and any large contributions, so donations, charitable giving, or just giving as a, hey, here's a yacht, that sort of thing should be required to be publicized.
And I can definitely agree with that.
So monetary, yes. Personal levels, no. That does mean that you could technically influence people by hiring a couple of hookers to go over and influence. And that would be a scandal in and of itself. Like those things do occasionally come out, and it has some juicy details, and usually that person's reputation is completely ruined. But I don't think that we should require that information is disclosed.
Yeah, I think that would be a little bit too much. And then we would get paparazzi for all of our government officials, which would not be fun for them.
It would discourage people from going into office, but it would also mean that only the crazier people go into office, and I don't think that we want even crazier people in the office.
Yeah, we can definitely agree on that.
Being a public official should be tolerable.
Yeah.
All right, so your life should not be made unlivably public, or at least excessively public to the point of discomfort. I'm trying to think of to what degree. Your life should be different as a public official, but your what we view as fundamental privacy rights should not.
Yeah.
That donations relative to campaign or of meaningful influence, so like buying you lunch every day, yeah, that's meaningful influence.
Yeah.
Okay. How about advertising?
Advertising can also be really tricky because you don't necessarily know who's paying for the advertisement.
So should the person that's paying for the advertisement be required to be disclosed?
I think that would be a great idea. Although I know sometimes even today, you get these advertisements paid by some big company that is really hard to track down who is actually behind it.
Mm-hmm. Sure, that they're a company that owns a company that's owned by another company, and it's difficult to tell exactly where the money is coming from.
Right.
Sure. Should that advertising have to go through the person that it's endorsing? If I like a presidential candidate and I want to run an advertisement saying, hey, this is a good presidential candidate, do I need to get that approved by them? I know that a lot of times in the U.S. elections, candidates will say, I'm so-and-so and I approve this message. It's a fairly stereotypical thing to do. Should that be required?
I think it would be a great idea for all the endorsements, especially if they actually have to know what's going into it.
Mm-hmm. But should I be able to talk about, so for instance, if I want to say something negative, well, they're obviously not going to endorse that. So
No, of course not.
right. So I don't think that we can require that they sign off on a message about them.
That's fair.
One of the problems that introduces is, let's say you are a candidate that holds a certain position and an organization that would hold the opposite position to you endorses you. As an example, again, with American politics, let's say that you are Bernie Sanders. And the NRA, for some reason, comes out and says, we endorse Bernie Sanders. He is our candidate. We think that he will do a lot of good things for the gun industry, and you should go vote for him. If that came out, do you think it would help or hurt Bernie's campaign?
Oh, it would really hurt.
Right. So you could damage another person's campaign with a positive advertisement if the people that are advertising go against fundamentally what you do or what you're saying you're going to do. So in that way, you could sabotage them positively. Should that be managed?
I mean, do we even see a lot of that happening?
I don't think so, because in this case, the NRA endorsing Bernie Sanders, that would make the NRA lose all confidence from their base of like, why are you doing this? You're endorsing a candidate that we fundamentally disagree with.
Right. And the groups that are going to cause the most turmoil by doing this are going to be those very large, typically nationwide groups.
Right. So they have reputations that if they endorse a candidate that they don't actually endorse, then they're losing reputation as well as the other person.
Right.
But if they just want to go down kicking and screaming and take you down with them, that can come into play.
That's true. And I can definitely see that with some types of organizations out there.
But I don't know if I've ever seen that happen.
Right. I don't know of an instance of it either.
Well, we've started this idea, so if there's anyone out there that wants to make politics interesting, there you go. There's an idea. So it sounds like we shouldn't really regulate that, or it's not a problem. At least it hasn't been.
Yeah.
So maybe not worried about giving positive endorsements to people that you actually disagree with for the purpose of reputation destruction. Probably not a problem.
Yeah.
So then the only other thing is, part of being elected, you need to be well known. People need to know about you. So paying for advertising is a way of doing that.
And advertising is not cheap.
Depending on what you do, yeah. I mean, if it's volunteers handing out flyers, that can be cheaper, but it requires volunteers. So if you're doing something like on television or before a video or on social media, that does just cost straight up money to do that sort of advertising. How should that be regulated?
Well, I definitely like the idea of people actually knowing where the money is coming from for these advertisements.
Okay, so if an advertisement shows up for a particular candidate, it should also have in that advertisement, here's who's paying for it.
Right. It would also be great if that would be relatively easy to track down who actually is behind that organization.
A disclaimer at the bottom of the screen, here's the organization, and here is the highest level parent company.
Yeah, I could definitely work with that.
I'm right on board. That, yep, this person is benefiting from this company. Perfectly fine with that. The other benefit to that is it shows who is associated with what group. And this is similar to my NRA and Bernie example. Let's switch it around and say that the NRA endorses Trump. If I don't like the NRA, and I know nothing about Trump, and I don't like the NRA, and the NRA endorses Trump, I can then assume, therefore, I probably won't like Trump.
Exactly.
So it informs voters in terms of what you can do. Or it informs voters on who they may or may not like. So even it's a positive influence, it's also a negative influence at the same time, and it's up to the advertisers to balance that.
Yeah,
So I think we're getting close to a fundamental idea or a fundamental concept. What about what we mentioned earlier with people passing out flyers and volunteers?
I mean, in that case, you've definitely got people who believe in your message. So
If they aren't part of an organization, does it matter?
I don't think it matters if they're not part of an organization. Now, if, say, you have a group of folks who all work at one particular company, that may say something about the company.
If it's an official company event.
Right. But if they're doing it out of their own free will because they just really, really like this candidate, okay, I'm not really concerned about it because those are individual people. And most of the time, they're not going to be high-profile people who could contribute a ton.
What if they just have a lot of money and have a lot of influence? They're not using their company dollars for it, but they're just using money that they happen to have because they own a large company. So they're using personal dollars. They give themselves a bonus and then use their personal dollars to get away from the requirement to have the company listed.
I mean, I would like to know who those people are still.
The other thing is, why would you not want your company listed if you're actually endorsing the candidate?
Right. That seems really shady.
You would have benefit to actually saying what your company is, because if you're standing by it and putting your name by it, people are more likely to believe it.
Right.
That's fair. So, but again, with personal support, should that be government regulated in terms of we have to know who you are and how much you're giving?
I think there needs to be some sort of minimum level for it need to be reported.
So beyond a certain dollar amount, there has to be some extra reporting.
Right.
Like
because,
what and why?
Well, so me giving a candidate $20, that $20 isn't going to go extremely far. But if I gave them $2 million or $20 million,
they're going to be able to do more.
Exactly.
So what information would be disclosed?
I'd want to know who is giving that much money. So that way I can find out, okay, this is what company they may be affiliated with or their thoughts on things.
So it's more of, if someone is donating a large sum of money, that dollar value to be determined, their identity should be associated with the funds.
Right.
So you can, if you're running a campaign, how much money your campaign has taken in should be known. People should know how much money you have, so that if one of the things that people want to vote on is, I don't want to vote on someone that spends $50 million for a campaign for a local office.
Yeah, that's crazy.
They're running against someone that spent $1 million. I will vote. Maybe they'll vote strictly on that, just on the principle. So campaign finances should be public knowledge, and over a certain dollar amount, that should also be public knowledge.
Right.
So that even if there's just 20 people that donated $5,000, if $5,000 is the limit, okay, yeah, you'll know who those 20 people are.
Yeah.
That may also mean that if the limit is $100,000, people would just pay $99,999.
Right. But unfortunately, we're probably going to have to draw a line somewhere if we're to regulate this.
Sure. So, and where that line is,
it's really fuzzy.
And it doesn't matter for the purpose of this discussion. It's more of, if you're receiving monetary benefits from an organization or from an individual past a certain dollar amount, I think advertising in any amount or just direct cash donation from any individual past a certain dollar amount, that should be public knowledge. That the campaign finances should be public knowledge, and the dollar amounts given from different organizations and different people should also be public knowledge. And any advertisement that's run for a candidate or against a candidate, the company should be posted as part of that advertisement. It should say what company it's coming from and the highest level parent company of that company, so that we know on a very granular level who is actually giving money towards this candidate or who is supporting this candidate.
Yep, I can agree with all of that.
That way, if there is someone from the industry, we know that they come from or are supported by the oil industry. And if we have questions about the oil industry and we don't really like them, then we know maybe we shouldn't vote for that candidate. The goal of all this being to inform the voter.
Exactly.
And I think that's fair, and I think that's our first kind of core concept.
Yeah.
Keep people informed during elections for who is trying to influence the election, how much are they trying to influence the election, and who are they influencing.
Yeah, I think those are the important points. Does kind of beg the question, though, about what happens outside of the elections, though.
So now we're getting into once they're in office. All right, they've been elected. There's a bunch of public knowledge out there. Now they're in office. How much information should be disclosed there?
So I think we need to have some level of this disclosure, kind of similar even to elections, because we still want to know who's giving them money, potentially if there are any kickbacks or bribes going on. If we know their financials, we have a much better idea of if that is even something that could be happening.
Did they suddenly acquire a yacht?
Exactly.
Or a new car or something along those lines. Yeah.
Right, because that would be suspicious.
Or travel expenses.
Right, because it's not necessarily tangible things all the time.
Sure. It's buying you lunch that you're not going to have that forever. It's just for the day. And travel, being able to go talk to new people. So particularly on presidential campaigns, flying to a state, flying to the next state, flying to another state. There's going to be a lot of travel in there, so you need to be able to spend that money. And where that money is coming from matters. If there's no cash donation, but they just happen to give you a ticket, that should still count as a cash donation.
Yep, I can agree with that.
And I think it's just a matter of having it be a regulation of you are required to disclose this.
Right.
So your finances should be under much more scrutiny, even if it's just under finance department scrutiny. Not necessarily public knowledge until it's determined that, hey, this is where that money came from. So we don't need to, the public should not know about when did you buy a banana at the grocery store.
Yeah, and they're not really going to care about that.
Right, but I think that for public officials, there should be other individuals that are looking into what sort of major cash flow do they have and where is it coming from.
Yeah, and I think that could really work because that also still gives them privacy.
Sure.
Because we don't really want our public officials to have paparazzi. We want them to at least live somewhat normal lives.
Right. And I think that's where the government should know where that money is coming from, not necessarily public knowledge.
Right.
If it's massive support and advertising support, yes, I think that that should be public knowledge. But in terms of how you're spending all of your money, public should not know about that. Once it's determined that this person from this industry purchased a senator this lunch, that I think should be public knowledge. And most people aren't going to care about that. But it should be available so that people will at least think twice about it. There should be limitations on how much people are able to benefit from it.
Yeah.
You should not be getting a yacht from an oil company. And again, I use this as an example a lot, but I think it's a good example of a very wealthy industry that has very strong reasons or good reasons to try and influence the government.
Exactly.
One thing I did want to bring up is, where does jurisdiction come into this?
That is a good point because, say, a senator or even just a representative, they have a small area of a country that they should be representing.
And it depends on the office. If you're working in the U.S. Senate, that may be a little bit different. You vote on laws that can affect the entire country.
Right. So then, okay, I could maybe see talking to people from other areas, but they really want to keep their state's interests in mind. If
Sure.
you are from a state like Kansas with a lot more farmers, you're going to work harder to get agricultural benefits for your state.
Maybe. So let's say you live in Kansas, or let's say you just moved to Kansas and you are being funded by another organization or another industry that wants more countrywide control. Let's say you work in Silicon Valley and you want to be able to gain control in Kansas. Let's say there's some law that you want to get implemented, but there's Kansas doesn't like it, Iowa doesn't like it. Basically, the Farm Belt doesn't like what's going on in Silicon Valley. Have someone move there, have a bunch of funding funneled in from Silicon Valley, pay for their election, get them elected. Now you have more influence. Should you be able to do that?
I don't like that they can do that because they don't really have the best interests of the area at heart. They don't necessarily understand their voters as well as somebody who's grown up in the area or has lived there for a while.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you, despite the fact that you have the ability as a U.S. Senator or a U.S. House of Representative, is it still Senator? If you work in the Senate or House of Representatives, you have say over everything that happens in the country. But if you are taking outside influence from outside of your jurisdiction, you are more likely to represent that other jurisdiction rather than your own. And the whole point of having jurisdictions for you to reside over and for you to represent is so that you represent that jurisdiction.
Right. And
So-
if the guy in Kansas is taking a lot of money from somebody in Silicon Valley, they're not really working with their jurisdiction
They're
anymore.
more inclined to vote for things that would be beneficial to Silicon Valley as opposed to Iowa.
Right.
So would you agree that in terms of lobbying, even if you do have say over things countrywide, lobbyists should not be able to be paying for advertisement, at least for the getting people elected. They should not be able to influence the election process outside or from outside of the jurisdiction. If someone is trying to become a representative, they should not be able to have any outside help from outside of their jurisdiction.
Well, I think that could also depend on what you consider outside of their jurisdiction. In some states, there might be somebody who's going up for election who is backed by the NRA.
Okay.
NRA is a national organization. So you could think of that as some other jurisdiction getting behind them, even though maybe locally the NRA is a big deal.
So should it be required that there's a local representation or a local section of that group?
I think so. I think that could help stem some of that and also help allow for some of those more national groups to be involved. Although then it gets tricky because
I think it creates a loophole because, I am, again, with oil industry. I am an oil industry executive. I want to get, I'm trying to think of a non-oily state.
Kansas.
Sure, Kansas. It's like, I'm in the oil industry. I want Kansas. I want to get Kansas's vote, and they don't really care, but I want them to care. So I am going to set up a small office in Kansas and have like one person working there part-time every once in a while, and they get most of the time off.
Right, that's the tricky thing, is it's so easy to set up something like that.
Right, but at the same time, you want national organizations to be able to endorse candidates even on a local level. But I think it depends on, I guess it may depend on what they're trying to represent. So for instance, I think that the NRA and the oil industry have different things that they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably. The NRA supposedly fights for gun rights. The oil industry supposedly fights for oil management. And I think that the oil industry benefits more financially than the NRA does because the NRA is donation-based.
Right.
As opposed to business-based. So if there is an organization that is donation-based, should that change the jurisdiction lines?
I think that can help, especially if we're thinking about something like the NRA. But
It does cause another loophole because then a company can just form an organization that they then donate a bunch of money to and then donate that money.
exactly. That's how you get the big long chains, and how on an advertisement where you see it today, oftentimes it's like paid for by X, Y, and Z company, and you actually have absolutely no idea who belongs to X, Y, and Z company.
Yeah. So how do we deal with jurisdiction lines? So I want to bring up a specific example because it's been somewhat contentious depending on who you're talking to. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She represents a relatively small district in New York. Based on public information, it looks like 55% of that, 55% of her donations that were coming from people came from outside of the state. Not even just in her district, but outside of the state of New York. And a large portion of that was from California, the opposite side of the country. Probably people who agree with her politically, but should that be allowed? Should you be able to donate to a candidate that is representing a different district that is the opposite side of the country as you are?
I think the opposite side of the country part makes it worse in this case.
Doesn't matter. What if it was from Pennsylvania?
That's still a little bit iffy. But I'm
geographically, they're still very different.
Right. That is definitely true. I was thinking like, okay, maybe you are in a different district in New York. That I would be much more understanding of than somebody in Pennsylvania or California making that donation.
So is it a state line? Is it a district line that matters? At what point do we literally draw the line?
I almost think state would be a good idea, but in the Northeast, that's not necessarily the best measurement because so many states are so small.
So I don't want to get too much into electoral college and weight of vote, but I think if you are outside of the jurisdiction, if you're outside of the district, you shouldn't be able to contribute to a candidate. Because the whole point of having a representative republic is being able to elect officials that represent your area. And if anyone outside of your district tries to interfere with that, it is more likely that the person elected is representative of the people who were funding them and not of the district. And to continue with the example before with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, recent polls have been done saying that, at least at the time of this recording, that from polls within her district, she has an 11% rating of people believing that she has their best interests in mind. 11% of people in her district believe that she has their interests in mind.
That's atrocious.
And given the fact that 55% of her funding came from outside of state, and the people in her district don't like her, or at least I think even lower than that would vote to re-elect her, at least according to polls, like, that is atrociously bad. And I think that that's the kind of thing that you get when you allow funding to come from out of state or even out of district. That the fundamental aspect of a representative republic is that you have representatives from your district. And as soon as money starts flowing over any sort of border, you are losing that influence, and you're losing the whole premise of a representative republic.
And I think that's fair to say. And in some cases, though, it gets really difficult because a lot of these districts can be gerrymandered like none other. So even if I was a Democrat in a very Republican area, as much as I want to vote for that Democrat candidate, my vote isn't really going to sway anything. But
right.
If I like the candidate in the next district over, who happens to be a Democrat, and that's a very Democratic district,
I want to be able to fund them.
Right. So, in that case, is it okay that I would be sending my money to a different district?
How about this? You can only send money to your district or a direct neighboring district.
I could be okay with that one, actually.
And so, we have District A, B, C, D. District B can only affect A, B, and C. District D can only affect District D and C.
I think that's a very fair way to look at it.
So, and because your direct neighbors can also affect you.
Right.
It's kind of like homeowners associations. And by the way, I hate homeowners associations. But there's something to be said for being able to say, I want to have a nice lawn, and I want my neighbors to have a nice lawn. That doesn't mean that I can say the people in 3 states over should also have a nice lawn.
Right. They're not really influencing you if their lawn is a bunch of weeds.
Right. So I think you can donate to you and your direct district neighbors. That's it.
I can agree with that. I think that's a decent compromise.
If you don't, it breaks down the fundamentals of a representative republic.
Right, because we don't need more money from California going to races in New York.
Right. And I think that's valid on the personal level. Individuals donating. What about companies? And what about organizations like the NRA that are donation-based? How do we deal with them?
Yeah, and if we're going to continue talking about the NRA, I mean, they are national.
Right.
So in that case, they could donate to any race across the U.S., which is kind of awkward in that regard because they may not be very much on the ground in some of those races. It's not an area that they have been active in before, and they're just trying to do it to drum up support.
So could it be that they are not allowed to give unaffiliated recommendations? So, for instance, if the NRA wants to run an ad for some representative that's running for the government, should they be able to endorse the candidate but not give money to the candidate?
I could see that.
So if, an NRA representative joins in an advertisement that is paid for by the candidate is the one that's paying out of pocket, but it's like, yep, we approve of this candidate.
Yeah, I think that could work. But that works maybe for something like the NRA. I'm also imagining a case where we have a company based in, say, California, and there's a senator running for office in West Virginia that is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And if they were elected, they would put some laws into place that would heavily regulate that company in California.
Sure.
Well, how are we going to handle that company in California if maybe they need a presence in the state? They could set up that quick office. They'd be done. It's kind of tricky.
I think it would be if you have a company and, again, part of a representative republic, the way that it works is, you have people from smaller districts have a larger say countrywide. That's the point. Does that mean that a company in Iowa or a representative from Iowa will be able to have a say of how Silicon Valley is run? Yes. But on the flip side, if they didn't, then Silicon Valley would take away all of the representative value from the Iowa representative. So it's you can choose between either, again with the California-Iowa example, either California gets their own senators and pays for a senator to take the place of someone that would be from Iowa, so that senator only has California's wants and desires in mind, or California has its own representative, Iowa has its own representative, and while they may clash sometimes, they both have a representative. Which of those two sounds better?
I mean, I want Iowa to have their representative.
Right. And while they may not have California's best interests in mind, and sometimes that will clash and they may vote in a way that it goes against that of California, it's probably because they're trying to keep Iowa's interests in mind. And I think that is the biggest benefit of a representative republic, is that the minority's vote is still heard. There's I think a Benjamin Franklin quote that I really like. Democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. A republic is a well-armed sheep contesting the vote. And I think that if we allow there to only be wolves, then there will be no sheep, because we'll be having sheep for dinner. In this example, Iowa would be the sheep, and if California sends a bunch of money to Iowa to get a representative elected, we just took away any defense that the sheep had. The minority's vote needs to be heard, and even though that means that the minority will have more control, maybe even disproportionate control, it's important to preserve the rights of the minority. And in this case, with deciding who gets elected, it's important to preserve the separation of the districts and who you're representing. Who you represent is important, and where that money is coming from is really important. Agreed?
Agreed.
So I think we're at another fundamental idea that basically what I just said of money should not be able to come from outside of your district because your job is not to represent who's paying the most. Your job is to represent your district. So money should only be able to come from your district or districts immediately outside of yours, so your direct neighbors. And we still haven't really figured out exactly how it should run with large organizations, but there should be major limitations, and you should not be able to just set up an office building with one person in it and say, oh, I can now donate to them.
Right.
But I think that endorsing, yes. Maybe buying yachts, no. If someone within my district is super rich and I'm running for office and they want to buy me a yacht, I think that's valid. It should be public knowledge, but I think that's fine. If they are outside of my district and they want to buy me a yacht, I think it should be forbidden.
I can definitely agree with that one.
And that kind of gets so you can still pay for advertisement, but it cannot go directly through them. They cannot be directly benefiting from it in terms of direct monetary benefit. Advertisements, sure, but I think let's add another piece of information. It needs to include company and where that company is based.
I like that.
So that if someone, again with the Ocasio-Cortez example, if someone sees an advertisement of, hey, you should vote for Ocasio-Cortez, paid for by California. I'm in New York. Why is it paid for by California?
Right. That's definitely going to get your attention.
Okay. So advertisements from companies outside of the district, perfectly valid, as long as it includes the company name, the parent company, and where the money is coming from. And that needs to be in the advertisement. Equally legible to everything else.
Yes, definitely agree with the equally legible.
It should not be fine print at the bottom of the screen. It should be equally legible to anything else that's on the screen.
Right. We want everybody to see it.
And if you don't want people to see it, then you probably shouldn't be advertising for that person.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about giving people yachts for a while. So why don't we take this a slightly different direction?
Okay.
We can look at it as lobbying versus bribery. Because if you give me a yacht, I mean, I could definitely take that as a bribe to do what you'd like.
So we're talking once, like, the person is elected. So I think we've covered pretty well getting elected. Now the person is elected. Now we're really into what most people I think would think of as lobbying. So we're going there.
Yep.
Okay. What would be the difference between support and a bribe?
I think a bribe is much more based on actually having a specific result. Like, hey, if you vote this way on a specific bill, I'm going to give you a yacht or lots of money, help pay for your campaign.
But a lot of times that's not even explicitly stated.
Right. It's definitely implied.
And that's, you can imply things completely outside of government influence. So, for instance, to go back to our sexual advances example, someone's making sexual advances and say, I'd really like to be able to dump toxic waste into this river. It would be so nice, as they're making sexual advances. Is that a bribe?
I mean, it could somewhat be construed as one.
I agree, but it's also a bribe that, like, no one's ever going to hear about that.
Right.
Unless it's done in public for some reason.
I'd be real worried if that was being done in public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So, how do you define a bribe? And how do you try to avoid bribes in the government?
So I think of a bribe as some sort of thing.
Something physical.
Right. Yeah, you would get something physical for having a specific outcome.
Not necessarily physical, but physical or monetary.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of lump physical and monetary in the same thing, but yeah.
Is lunch a bribe?
Kind of depends on this lunch. If you were taking me out to Chick-fil-A, for example, that's very different than a very nice upscale restaurant with lots of caviar and fancy wine.
Although apparently in modern American politics, taking them to Chick-fil-A specifically, well, that has political connotations to it.
Yeah, that probably wasn't the best choice.
Oh, I think it's a funny choice because, oh, well, it's not just a chicken sandwich,
Oh, yeah. But in that case, fast food restaurant, that's not going to cost you very much. That's not really bribing someone too much, but fancy restaurant.
No, it's maybe a small bribe.
That's true.
Have you been to Chick-fil-A?
I always want to go on Sundays.
Right? It's always when you can't have it that you want it.
Exactly.
So, does the size of a bribe really matter? I mean, okay, getting a chicken sandwich versus getting a yacht, yeah, there's a difference there.
Right.
I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, that there should be someone looking into that financing. And that if there is any flow of money or resources to a government official from any company, that should it just be from anyone?
Honestly, that's not a bad idea, because there are some people who may not be backed by a company but have a lot of money and are well known for what they are going for, that knowing like, oh yeah, this person is influencing this government
their
official.
finances should be monitored.
Right.
And anything that they themselves do not directly purchase, but that they can benefit from, even just going golfing. Did you pay for that golf? No. Okay. That is public knowledge now. It's like, it's just a high school buddy of mine. Doesn't matter. High school buddy of yours may actually be trying to influence you, and what if that high school buddy of yours works for the oil industry?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who, doesn't matter if it's family or not. If you did not pay for it, that
needs
should
to be reported.
It needs to be reported. It needs to be public knowledge. Most of that won't matter. If it's a $5 lunch, it's not going to matter. People won't care. But if you suddenly get a $100,000 car, yeah, people are going to care and will want to know where it's coming from.
Right. Especially if that $100,000 car comes right after you voted on a bill that benefited that car company.
Right. So should that sort of large purchase just be completely stopped? Should an oil company be able to get a $100,000 car for a senator? Should that type of donation even be allowed?
I'd say no. Because if they're buying them large gifts, it's hard to say why. Especially if it's a tangible item.
So, but for a car, let's say you actually do need a car to be able to go to and from work. It's something that is useful for your job. Because one of the other things I was thinking is maybe they can only take donations that help facilitate them doing their job. Lunch? Sure. I need lunch to be able to live.
Right.
Dinner? Same thing. Travel? Sometimes I need to travel. If I need to vote on something in the oil industry, maybe I want to go visit that company to see how things are done. So
yeah, that's not a bad reason.
So paying for travel? Sure. Even if the oil company says, yes, we will pay for you to come out and see our facilities.
Yeah, that's better than knowing nothing.
Right. I would rather have well-informed senators than not well-informed senators. So, okay. Paying for being able to do your job is okay. Should there be limitations if they're getting a car? Should there be limitations on how expensive of a car?
I would like to think so, but then you get into a whole bunch of social class things as well.
Sure.
Because, our government officials, especially the higher they are in the government, are going to be hanging around other people, more like CEOs, higher level folks in the oil industry. And as much as I love my Civic, that's going to look very out of place.
How about this? You can receive donations, physical or monetary. Well, monetary we'll come back to, but you can receive physical donations for, actually, yeah, including not directly monetary, but value. So, for instance, flights, airplane flights, that's a monetary value, but it's not direct money.
Yeah.
So let's say average for what is being purchased. If a company wants to buy you a car, take the average of how much a new car costs. That's how much you can spend. That's how much you can donate. If the senator or government official wants to then add their own money to that to get an upgraded car, sure. You can use the money that is coming from that company to augment a better purchase, but it should only be average amount or less, which also means that they would be flying business or economy class.
I'd like to see them fly economy class.
And now, if they want to pay for an upgrade to first class,
Sure.
okay, but it's coming out of your pocket.
Yeah.
That's where the limitation should be. They should not be living in high society just because people are paying for them to live there. If they happen to have enough money to be able to live in high society or use the donations as an augment for high society, I'm okay with that. But the donations themselves should be equal to average.
What are we going to call average, though? Because thinking about a car, we have things ranging from 14,000 to 50 plus.
New car. So, new car, what is the cheapest new car that you can get? And I mean, it's not the range. It's not the median. It's not the median, because there are $2 million cars,
Right.
and then there's going to be a $15,000 car. I'm not saying the middle of those.
Okay.
I'm saying the average, and there are going to be a lot of $15,000 or $20,000 new cars, and there are maybe $5 million cars.
Right.
So, average of all new model cars. In that particular example of cars. Flights, if you are flying, you can take an average flight. Now, there are going to be CEO flights that cost $50,000, but for every one CEO flight, there's going to be probably a couple thousand passenger flights, normal passenger flights.
There's going to be so many tickets.
Right. So you take the average of how much it usually costs to fly the distance that you're flying.
I think that's fair.
That's it. Average cost that they are allowed to donate up to the average. You can augment it. The representative can augment it with whatever they want from their personal funds, but that's all that they can accept. And in terms of donations, so for instance, a yacht. Well, how much is an average yacht? It's another question. Should people be able to accept yachts or large ticket items that do not augment them doing their job? I would say no.
And I can agree with that, because nobody really needs a yacht.
You can accept things that I think there should be an explicit list of what is actually needed to perform their job, or meaningful. Like, do you need to fly out to Texas to check out that oil industry? Well, yeah, kind of. Like, it's arguable.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
Right.
But you don't necessarily need to fly into Las Vegas for a weekend.
Right. I don't think that there's much going on in Hawaii in terms of, I don't think there's any oil refining or oil, nothing coming from Hawaii.
Probably not.
Oil going to Hawaii, sure, but not really coming from. So, we'll fly you out to Hawaii. No. You need to be able to justify the purchase. And if it can't be justified to help you do your job or meaningfully know about your job, no. You should not be able to accept donations in that way.
I think that's reasonable. I couldn't imagine being that government employee who has to read over all the justifications and say yes or no.
And I think the exception to that is because there are gift limits. If you weren't aware of this, I believe that the largest gift you can give to someone that isn't taxable is something like $13,000.
Okay.
In
Somewhere in that range.
In the U.S., that past a certain level, it becomes taxable. So if your family member happens to work for the oil industry and they want to give you a gift, can they still give you a gift?
I mean, that's tricky because it's your family member, but also oil industry.
So I'll say this. Only direct family members can actually give you gifts if you're working for the government. And that taxable limit should just be the limit.
I could definitely see the taxable limit being the limit.
Now, that also means that, and this is I think a lifetime limitation, which means if you become a senator or you become a government representative that has voting power, for the rest of your life, you're very limited on any gifts that you're allowed to be given.
Why would you say rest of your life rather than just the time you're in office?
Because if I have a family member in the oil industry, hey, you should become a senator and vote on this particular bill that's being suggested. Okay, while you're in office, well, I can't give you anything. Hey, you're out of office? Here's a yacht. Lifetime. And normally, for most things, a lifetime limitation, that feels like jail. That feels harsh. But when you are voting on things that have a longer reach than your lifetime over all individuals within your district or in the country,
It'll make you think twice.
It will make you think twice. That part of being able to serve in the government means I am giving up other things in my life that I could do. And I think that would make public office more valuable, because it would mean the people that are going here
They believe in it.
They believe in it, and they're not doing it to make the rest of their life better. They're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do.
We would probably have a whole lot better representatives if that was the case.
I agree. I think that it's a really harsh limitation. Well, really harsh. Only $13,000 gifts for people in really high society. Okay, yeah, maybe that.
Right, but that could also bring it down to more the average Joe.
Sure. And you are more likely to be representative of the majority of the people.
Exactly. So that would be a lot better off for a lot of people.
Yeah. So I really like that suggestion of government officials should not be able to take any gifts that does not directly benefit their ability to do their job more than average for the rest of their life.
I like it.
Gives you a lot of motivation to not do things that, not take benefits from companies that you shouldn't be.
Right, because you'll know you'll be taken care of. You're not going to have to worry too much about anything, so there's not really much of an incentive.
Sure, that like, hey, I need to go out and get lunch. Well, we want to influence you as much as we can, and we want to talk to you. We want you to view us fondly, so we'll go out and buy you lunch. Cool. That doesn't mean that you're not gonna be getting yachts. You're not gonna be going golfing all the time. At least if you're going golfing, you're gonna have to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, limiting the amount of money that's flowing in, not limiting it in the sense of like, we want you to do a good job. Particularly if you need to do a lot of traveling, that's perfectly understandable. Yes, that can be contributed. For presidential campaigns, yes, you should be able to travel because you need it. That is directly important to your the ability to do your job.
Right.
But in terms of gift donations, which I think is what a lot of times is what we're more contentious about in the bribes, any money that is flowing in or any donations should have a direct positive influence and be necessary for your job or be able to be justified for your job. You should not be able to contribute more than the average value of the thing that you're trying to contribute. The representatives can augment that with their own money if they wish, but they also give up the ability to receive gifts over a certain value for the rest of their life to make sure that the reason that they're going in there and becoming a senator or becoming a representative is to represent the people and not to be influenced through bribes.
I think that's a great way to do it.
So we've talked about money a lot, and I think that I'm at a comfortable spot with money flow.
Yeah, I think we've covered that pretty well.
What about people flow?
I think that's a tricky one because we see a lot of that today where you have an executive from industry either going into government or somebody from the government going out into an industry.
Like, oh, I'm going to become an official and put in some regulations and then I will benefit from them.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to know all the ins and outs. You're going to have people on the inside that y'all can talk to. Makes it a whole lot easier.
Mm-hmm. But again, if you're not getting direct benefits from that industry, or I guess if you are working for industry, then go into the government, then work for that industry again, you just get a bunch of bonuses. And it's not a gift. You're just earning money.
Right. I'm not quite as concerned about those people, especially if they came from the industry in the first place.
But it's like, oh, we want to be able to regulate this. Okay. Run your campaign, get elected, and vote on some things that would be beneficial for us, and then we'll hire you back. That's really questionable. A people flow, and that's the sort of people lobbying that I'm talking about, that can be problematic.
That is true. Because, who knows? Was that a bribe? To give them a very nice cushy job when they got out? It's hard to say.
But at the same time, if we say you can't work in any industry that you voted on, that really limits job opportunities after they're out.
Oh, yeah, especially because they could vote on tons of different industries.
Right. Even if they just vote no, if I don't want to vote on this bill, you're still voting.
Yeah. And we don't really want to do that because they're going to have to go back to society.
Sure. So how do we prevent the people from voting and then benefiting from those votes as opposed to a direct bribe?
Man, we could almost use SEC rules in that regard of insider trading, but that would probably be hard to implement in the real world.
I'm also not super familiar with what those rules are.
So it's more just along the lines of if you have insider information, you shouldn't be using that to gain money.
Which is really hard to manage.
Right.
Because who has what insider information, and even if you benefit from it, how do you prove that that person knew it?
Exactly. And that would be really hard to do with people, too.
Mm-hmm.
Not just stocks. So that's not something we could really operationalize well.
How about this? If you are a public official, similar to putting a limit on gifts and a limit on how much you can get after you're out of office, put an earnings limit on how much you can make from a job after you leave office.
That could be interesting. I think you'd have to be careful, though, because you'd have to take into account the cost of living in different areas of the country. Living in the middle of nowhere, Texas, is very different than the middle of New York City.
Sure. I'm saying more along the lines of, like, I would want to avoid... I keep on bringing up oil execs. It's just because that's where there's a lot of money.
Yeah, and it's a good example.
And a lot of attempted government influence. Okay. So I work for the government, I vote on some things, and I want to work for the oil industry again with no ill intent. Okay, I should be able to work for the oil industry. However, we don't want people to be able to vote and then go back in and get a buttload of money. Figure out what a limit would be. I'm not saying average, but just there. I think that there should be a limit that means you will not be paid like a high-end CEO.
When you say paid, are you referring specifically to salary, or are you also including
salary
stock?
and bonuses?
Okay.
And any monetary benefit that they get from their job should have a limit to it.
Okay.
And that's not to say that you can't make money or you can't make good money. You should be able to live well, but to avoid people abusing the system or getting around the donation limitations and gift limitations, that look, you are affecting a lot of people with your vote.
Absolutely.
And that ability, that power comes at the cost of limiting the rest of your life. Not destroying it. You're not sacrificing your life, but I think that it should come with, there should be a limitation on it.
Yeah, and using oil as an example, I can definitely understand that because it would be very easy to make tons of money when you got back out.
I'm trying to think of an example. Let's take a district that has a very high cost of living. I think New York is one of them.
Yeah, something in New York City.
Costs a lot. It's something like $200,000 or $250,000 a year.
Something in that range, just to be like making it okay.
Sure. So how about this? You take the area that has the highest average cost of living. They're not allowed to make, in terms of salary and bonuses and any other monetary benefits, more than the highest cost of living in the country.
That could definitely be interesting.
So, like, you may live very well if you decide to live there, or if you take that, if you're able to make that money. So, again, with the oil company example, oil company says, hey, we'll once now that you're out of office, we'll hire you on as a consultant and we'll pay you $250,000 a year. I'm not really even doing anything. Oh, that's fine. We'll still pay you $250,000 a year, and then you move to the middle of the country and you are making bank and making a lot of money for doing nothing, and you're not actually spending it as a cost of living. You're just
you don't need much
ways.
if you live
You know
in the
what?
country.
I'm okay with that. You will live a really nice life, but you are not going to live a inordinately rich life. As in, you're not going to be making $1 million a year. You're not going to be like CEO salary of $50 million a year or anything like that. You're going to live a decent life.
Yeah, because I'm just imagining 250,000. Maybe live in the middle of nowhere, Texas.
Sure.
You're gonna go far.
You're going to go far. You're going to have a really nice life in terms of money. Money doesn't buy everything, but
your needs will be taken care of.
Yes, your needs will be taken care of, and if that's the risk that we have to take, that like I don't want to prevent people from living a nice life after they do public servitude.
Right, because then nobody would go into it.
Right, except for the crazy people, and we don't want crazy people being the only ones in our
we
government.
don't need them.
Right, we want people to still be willing to serve, and while there should be very close regulations on making sure that people aren't bribed before, during, or after, I don't think that it should be a 100% limitation. It's like, put a reasonable limit so that you can still be reasonably rich. And let's be honest, I think it's unlikely that there are going to be many circumstances where like someone will say, yeah, we'll give you $250,000 per year to do literally nothing because of the way that you voted.
That would have to be a very crazy regulation.
And that's a very expensive vote.
Yep.
$250,000 for the rest of your life. Really?
Oh, yeah. I would hate to know what bill that would be.
Also, if you're accepting that, I'd be really paranoid of like, wow, they're paying me $250,000 for the rest of my life. I'm 30. Like, are they really going to be paying me for the next 50 years?
Or do they have plans?
Oh, yeah. Or am I just going to wake up one morning? Am I going to wake up to a bump in the night?
Yeah. Which certainly would not be surprising.
It wouldn't be unimaginable. So, are we okay with that limitation? Is that a reasonable limitation that the type of life that you're living now has a cap on it? As part of your ability to influence other people and decide how the country moves forward, the lifestyle capabilities in your future will be limited.
I think that's reasonable. It would help us prevent bribes, for sure. And as long as we don't set the cap to something unreasonably low, okay. It's not really going to hurt anybody.
And that would need to be determined, and granted, the people that would be voting on it are the people that are going to be affected by it.
But that's how it always goes. I mean, even the Senate, I think they vote on their own raises every year.
Yeah. That'd be nice to be able to do.
Yeah. Maybe one day.
Maybe. So, again, changing onto a different branch. What about just what types of regulations you can try to influence? And this is more along the lines of just government influence by industries in general. There are examples where companies will add regulations or suggest regulations that actually would hurt their ability to operate. However, it also hurts their competitors' ability to operate, particularly smaller organizations. So let's say that there's a company that is very, very large, well-established, has been around for 50 years, and they want to implement government regulations to have loads of new safety standards all over on every piece of equipment. Really expensive safety standards. They would be able to eat the cost and meet those safety standards. Small competitors would not, meaning those small competitors would just die out, go out of business, and they eliminate competition. They eliminate small competition and can end up monopolizing through their influence. it's a very different branch of lobbying because it's
Right. We usually think more about positive, where people are influencing politicians to get something good to happen, like remove regulation.
right. But even increasing regulations, maybe you can use it to your advantage. So the question would be, how much should, in terms of lobbying, it's not just money flow, it's information flow. That I can be telling government officials, here's how my industry works. Here's what I think would be good. And some of those may actually be good ideas, and some of those safety regulations may be good, but if it's for nefarious purposes, is there a way of limiting the information flow from businesses or from people to the government, or should that just be an open flow of information?
If we leave it open, then that means that the largest companies, like this one that's trying to make a monopoly that you're talking about, are going to monopolize the floor. Those small companies won't even have a chance to say anything and get the word in about, hey, maybe some of these regulations are a bad idea.
Yeah, and because those small companies are also focusing on just getting larger and not going under.
Right. They probably don't even have the money to have somebody on Capitol Hill helping them out.
Right. And I think it is important to have people informing government officials of like, hey, so this piece of regulation that you have, for instance, like let's say the healthcare industry, because that's been a very large topic in American politics and just actually even worldwide. It's like, okay, let's say that the government wants to regulate and say, you need to have software that does X, Y, and Z. And you need to have it in the next 2 years and implemented. That's going to be a boat. Like maybe that is a simple feature that it just requires a check mark. It requires an hour of development and you're done. Cool. What if it's, we want you to be able to transfer any patient record to any other organization, regardless of system.
That's a lot.
They may have to spend 50% of their development resources for 6 months to be able to create that, which is going to be a huge monetary sink from the industry. And then they also need to test that and then get that adopted by the industry within that 2-year time frame. If the people making the law have no idea how difficult it is to implement, they may implement impossible laws.
Yeah, they'll see it as, oh, this is reasonable, because that's what the public is interested in,
right,
without realizing the technical limitations.
Right. So I think it's critically important for people to give information to government officials, because that's what government officials need to know in order to be able to do their job. So the question is, at what point if you say, oh yeah, sure, we can do 1,000 hours of software development to be able to implement this feature, no problem. But then a small organization is like, 1,000 hours of development, that is 3 times as the amount of the development hours that we have available. So,
and it's not like developers appear out of thin air.
Right. So how should it be regulated of how much information should people be able to give? Should it just be a limit of how much information can be given, and how do you measure information?
Yeah, I think measuring information is difficult, because if you are succinct...
Should it be regulated at all? Should it be just up to the government officials to determine, hey, you said this, but I don't think that makes sense, and there's a limit on how much monetary benefit I can get from actually voting for you, so I'm just going to make the best decision I can? Should we just have to trust our government officials to be able to do that?
At some point, we do have to trust them, unfortunately, because we hope that they have enough information, but when we have one voice that's crowding out everything else, they don't necessarily have all the information. I would ideally like them to hear both sides. Almost, maybe not quite a debate, but something more unbiased, because oftentimes they're talking to somebody from the industry who very much knows what they want. If I was coming from the industry, I would not want any of these regulations in many cases, because I would have to divert my resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I was talking to them, I would say, no, I don't want any of this. Whereas maybe, say, a patient advocate would be like, wait a minute, think about it this way. We actually do need this for X, Y, and Z. Knowing both sides would certainly help our representatives make that decision, but oftentimes I don't think they have both sides right now. And I don't think we can regulate having both sides. There's no way we can force them to go talk to everybody involved in these decisions, because that would be a ton of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like smaller organizations can still have informants or lobbyists of people who talk to government officials and inform of like, hey, here's how our industry is working. Here's how it will affect smaller organizations. I think the challenge is that they don't have as many resources to be able to do that. So
Right. They might write a letter instead of flying somebody out to meet them.
Sure. But the larger organizations have a larger say in that industry. That they are larger for a reason, usually. So they should have more of a say in how things are regulated. Because it's going to disproportionately affect them.
I think that's fair.
But this is coming back to the idea of representative republic, of you want the minority to still have a voice. And I think that the way that we're doing that in this way, at least with what we were talking about earlier, is limiting the monetary benefits and really financial and lifestyle benefits of the people that are voting, so that while they're being informed in different ways, only the information that is being fed to them is influencing them and not money, which limits the power of the large organizations. They still have the information power, but not the money power.
But even then, if they have so much information power, is it really that much different? If I'm crowding out all of the little companies out there, well, I'm pretty much going to get my way.
So how can we limit the power of large organizations in terms of information and say of like, here's how we think that would affect the industry. How do we also have the small companies say, well, here's how we think that would affect the industry?
Exactly. Now, it's not necessarily to say that the large organization shouldn't have more say if we're trying to be representative, but we don't want to block out, great example talking about like California versus Iowa. We don't want to block out Iowa from this.
Sure. I'm just thinking something along the lines of public forums. Of, this is a bill. We need information on this bill. So we're going to be talking about it. We are going to have a public hearing of anyone that works in the industry has a right to speak here. Small organizations, large organizations, you have the right to speak. And the time that you are allotted to speak will be equal.
I can see that. The larger organizations would probably send more people.
Probably, but while they would have more people, which means that they would have more speaking time. They would have to be different people, which means that they would inherently have different biases and different ideas, even if that large company filters them out. But the people who are in the smaller organizations, it's like, okay, they're going to talk about this for a week. Yeah, I'm really busy and I need to keep doing this, but this is really important. I'm going to take a week and go put my 2 cents in.
Yeah.
I think that's valid. Have public forums that the time that you are able to give information to your senators is set. That there are public forums for the purpose of gathering information and giving it to government officials, your representatives, anyone from the industry.
It's welcome to come talk about it.
Exactly.
I think that could work. Logistically, it might be a little bit crazy.
It would be difficult, but I think it is within the realm of possibility. And it would be a way of protecting small organizations from the influence of large organizations in terms of government regulation.
Yeah. It would also definitely give the government a much wider range of people talking about specific topics.
That's true. And not just the few people that can actually afford a full-time employee for government lobbying.
Or even just the people that they would assume care about a specific topic.
Mm-hmm.
They may not even realize that this group over here would actually be affected.
Mm-hmm. Or, just organizations that maybe they never heard of.
Yeah. I'm sure there are a lot of cases of that.
Absolutely. So I think I hit all the points that I wanted to get to. Same for you?
Yep.
Yeah, we talked a lot about money. because I think that that's one of the biggest aspects of lobbying is donations, election influence, paying for advertising, association with advertising. We talked about people lobbying, of being able to work in the industry, then go into government, and then potentially working in the industry again, and the risks associated with that. We talked about ways of trying to avoid that, as well as information lobbying, of how should information flow to government representatives, which is necessary and critical for them to be able to do their job. But at the same time, you want to make sure that the smaller organizations, that the smaller groups in the industry also have their voices heard. And so having sorts of public forums where everyone is able to have time slots allotted to them, of being able to put forth their thoughts and their beliefs with how different regulation would affect the industry. And while large organizations would have more people, smaller organizations would still have a say and be able to have influence over what information goes to the government officials.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Cool. So I don't know about you, but I'm hungry. Can I get you some Chick-fil-A?
Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.